So I'm, just by way of background, I'm Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford. I'm also founding director of something called the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which is a research, education and policy advice organisation within Oxford University that looks at the evidence for the social, ecological and economic effectiveness of working with nature in a warming world. And today I'm going to talk to you about the importance that we really think about adaptation to climate change. I'm going to talk to you about the UK government's response to the imperative of both mitigation and adaptation to climate change, and my role as a member of the Adaptation Committee of the UK Climate Change Committee. I then thought you'd be interested to hear about some work we've done on assessing the potential of nature-based solutions, of working with nature in the UK to help build resilience across the country, and report back on some work that we did, including lots of interviews and surveys around the UK on what the barriers are to scaling up nature-based solutions and how we might best overcome them. So let me first of all I'll start rather bleakly, but I think it's important that we really do understand the risks that we face from climate change. So according to the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, on the physical basis of climate change, essentially it's clear that we will surpass 1.5 degrees of warming since pre-industrial times by 2040. The evidence is also very clear that the extreme temperatures and other extreme weather events that are becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly severe are related to human activities, human-induced climate change. We know there's a great deal of variation across the surface of the globe in what those impacts are. We are clear that certain tipping points are irreversible tipping points, I should say, are a real possibility and becoming an increasing possibility. And we also are clear on the fact that methane levels, a very powerful and potent greenhouse gas, have now exceeded safe levels within our atmosphere. So in terms of what all that means for us trying to inhabit planet Earth, well, according to a second report that focused on impacts, adaptation, vulnerability, which is going to be the focus of this talk, we know that impacts of climate change are widespread, and that even if temperature rises are limited to 1.5 degrees, which is the best case scenario we can hope for, there will be irreparable loss of glaciers, polar ice, the majority of our coral reefs by the end of the century, and under all scenarios, 1 billion more people are projected to be at risk from coastal specific climate hazards in the coming decades. And we have a lot of coastline, we should be very concerned about that. The recent scientific syntheses performed by the IPCC on adaptation also showed that with each increment of additional warming, there is an increase in the incidence and severity of the resulting impacts of climate change. So it's been estimated that 2 degrees of warming will expose an additional 65 million people to exceptionally extreme heat waves every 5 years, and would take the number of people exposed to water scarcity up to 3 billion. Different parts of the world are differently affected, and all evidence suggests that climate change is going to basically increase global inequality, expanding the gap between rich and poor countries. Thinking about the natural world, which is the focus of today, I think, is that nature can adapt, it can move, it can shift, but the speed and pace of global warming is so extreme that it's been estimated that around 2 degrees of warming will put around 10%, at least 10% of all plant and animal species at high risk of extinction. So this urgency of where we are right now, one hopes it is currently focusing the minds of our world leaders and the delegations of all the world countries that are gathered in Egypt for the next 2 weeks. But the urgency means that significant investments need to be made in the next few years if we are to adapt to the current consequences of climate change and to prevent these sort of worst case scenarios that we will otherwise face. So sort of a bleak start, but this is a solutions-focused day and a solution-focused talk, but it's important that we're on the same page with how urgent everything is. So, but in recognition of the severity of the situation, I think the UK government showed great leadership in passing the Climate Change Act in 2008. This act requires that emissions of greenhouse gases are reduced and that climate risks are adapted to. So it covers both mitigation and adaptation side. And through this act, the government has set a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and also establishes a pathway to get there. Now, the Act additionally established the Committee on Climate Change to ensure that those targets are evidence-based and independently and regularly assessed, or progress towards them is regularly assessed. And the Act requires the government to assess the risks and opportunities from climate change for the UK and to have a plan, the National Adaptation Plan, that is, to adapt to them. So the Climate Change Committee has a Mitigation and Adaptation Committee, which I'll show in the next slide. I might move that on now. And I sit on the Adaptation Committee. This advises on the climate change risks and assesses progress towards tackling them. So the government is required, as part of the Act, to publish a UK climate change risk assessment, sort of abbreviated to the CCRA, and it's required to do this every 5 years. Now, the past two assessments have been carried out by the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee, with the most recent one published in 2021. It also requires the government to publish what they call a national adaptation programme to address the risks that have been assessed in the CCRA. And the next one is due next summer, all being well. And this programme sets out the actions that the government is taking to adapt to climate change in the UK, and is largely based on responding to that all-important risk assessment. So in terms of just, so that you feel informed about this committee, there are two committees. There's a mitigation committee, which really focuses on greenhouse gas emission reductions, and then there is the adaptation committee. And each of these committees is made up of experts covering a very wide range of related fields from across science and business and so forth. Now, below the committee is a secretariat of around 50 people, mainly analysts, and they produce all they collate the data and produce all the analyses and run scenarios and so on that then underpins and feeds into into policy recommendations. Now, recently we've been bringing together the teams so that they're working together much more synergistically than they have previously. So we're building bridges across the mitigation and adaptation, which is incredibly important. You do mitigation well, you need less adaptation. You do adaptation well, especially when it comes to working with land and nature, then less mitigation will be needed. There is also an expert advisory groups on certain topics, for example, nature, finance and energy supply, and these bring in broader expertise from around the country and also internationally. So as I say, I sit on the Adaptation Committee. I joined it earlier this year in May, and I'm the expert on the committee on sort of land and nature-based solutions. But I also attend a mitigation committee too, as land is very much something that requires a synergistic approach between mitigation and adaptation. And I also act as a champion on nature and nature-based solutions and provide oversight in ensuring that nature, which I argue strongly is a cross-cutting feature, features throughout our analysis. So as I say, my expertise is on nature-based solutions, and this is what I really want to focus this talk on. I understand you're having a workshop or a discussion this afternoon on it. So just some definitions I think are important to start with. Nature-based solutions involve working with and enhancing nature to address a societal goal. So whether that's climate change mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk reduction, food security, water security, whatever it might be, the intervention is designed to address that goal, but it has to provide benefits locally to biodiversity and to people. Otherwise, those interventions won't be sustainable, because we know that biodiversity is that which secures the resilience of our habitats. More diverse a habitat, the more able it is to withstand shocks and perturbations and changes and new diseases and all these threats that we increasingly face under climate change. Now, the concept of a nature-based solution, which has sort of been growing in popularity as a term, particularly over the last couple of years, is grounded in the knowledge that healthy ecosystems, healthy species-rich connected ecosystems, provide a wide range of services to people, services on which ultimately our economic health and our well-being depends. So, greenhouse gas reduction, flood and erosion control, coastal defence, cooling and shading, livelihoods, all sorts of other things, also cultural, spiritual values and social capital. And the concept also arises from the realisation that really you can't tackle climate change without also addressing biodiversity loss and vice versa. They have many of the same drivers, such as industrial agriculture, and hence many of the same solutions, such as nature-based solutions. But of course, the extent to which nature brings these benefits, is very, very place-based. Local context is incredibly important, as we'll discuss, and it also depends on, how we invest and how we implement those nature-based solutions over the long term in a rapidly changing world, especially when climate change itself undermines the health of ecosystems. So much of the limelight on nature-based solutions, as you might be aware, in the media and in policy discussions too, has been really focused on sort of the carbon aspects of nature-based solutions, the extent to which, if we work with nature, that can increase the storage of carbon and reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. But my interest really in nature-based solutions emerges around, is focused on their importance for addressing climate change adaptation. And I think the strength of the evidence is much greater for the role of nature-based solutions in supporting adaptation, actually, especially somewhere like the UK. So we were delighted at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative that the RSPB and WWF asked us to produce a report on the use of nature-based solutions for adaptation in the UK. And so we did a review of the literature, and we looked at how nature-based solutions can address key climate risks, and we interviewed practitioners from across the country, held a workshop on how, to find out how we scale up the deployment of good quality nature-based solutions. So I thought you'd be interested to hear, in brief, what we found as part of this talk today. So one of the key strengths of nature-based solutions is that they can address multiple climate risks listed here along the top. So, for example, let me just run through that. Restoring our marine and coastal ecosystems not only protects us from floods and coastal erosion, but can also support our fish supplies. Our fisheries are very much dependent on coastal ecosystem health. Natural flood management, rural woodlands, floodplain reconnection, river restoration, peatland restoration and so forth, can help tackle flooding and erosion, and can also help improve water quality and recharge groundwater supplies by improving infiltration. In urban areas, sort of green and blue infrastructure, so sort of, urban trees and green spaces, but also, ponds and sustainable drainage and so forth. This can tackle flooding and water quality, and it can also reduce urban heat effects. Agroecology, for example, hedgerows, buffer strips, agroforestry within our working lands can address all these issues and also make food production more resilient to climate change by improving soil health and soil water retention and using more diverse crops and livestock mixes. So, nature-based solutions can really, different types of nature-based solutions can together address many of the climate risks we face. And in fact, when we looked at the third UK climate change risk assessment, we found that evidence that nature-based solutions in the UK can address around 33 of the 34 risks where further adaptation action is needed, and all 8 of the most urgent risks all listed here. So I'm not going to go into the details. You can, if you're interested, read the details of this table in our report, which I will make available. But just to skim through it quickly, nature-based solutions by definition should support biodiversity, which addresses risks to habitats and species. Agroecology, as I say, can address risks to soil health, and nature-based solutions can protect the carbon stored in ecosystems. And agroecology can also address a wide range of risks to other forms of farming. The only one risk, the 34th risk, not addressed by the evidence to date at least, is risks to health from vector-borne diseases. So that was the one where we couldn't find evidence for that. At the same time, the very important thing to bear in mind about a nature-based solution, almost by definition, is that they deliver these multiple benefits, or co-benefits as they're sometimes referred to. All nature-based solutions by definition bring benefits for biodiversity, but if they are designed well, most will also have benefits for climate change mitigation, so carbon storage, and for health and well-being by providing places for recreation and interaction with nature. Meanwhile, sort of urban green walls can also help filter out air pollution, and agroecology supports livelihoods. But of course, there are some trade-offs. Protecting and restoring ecosystems can reduce some opportunities for fishing and farming, at least in the short term, although there should be longer-term benefits to the resilience of those sources of agriculture. And they can also conflict with activities such as grouse moor management and, more importantly, for food production, say in the fenlands, which is where we find some of our most productive farmland. And of course, there's been a lot about this, but trees in the wrong place, so trees on peat, heathlands, semi-natural grasslands, can have very adverse effects on biodiversity, water supply, and so forth. Woodlands can support rural livelihoods if harvested, but then that leads to trade-offs with carbon. So there are these, many, many benefits, but we do, of course, have a limited amount of land, and we need to think very carefully about what trade-offs we can afford and manage for those. Now, currently, in adaptation policy, not only in the UK but globally, the default is engineered alternatives, engineered solutions, so seawalls, irrigation channels, and technology, grey technology in general. But there are, nature-based solutions do have many benefits, many advantages not shared by them. So there's lots of evidence from the UK, but also from global studies, that nature-based solutions, as I said, can protect from multiple hazards. They bring these additional benefits. They can survive smaller sort of storm events. They've got, of course, their capacity for self-repairing and evolving and adapting. There's some evidence that some ecosystems can keep pace, for example, with sea level rise. There's evidence from mangroves, for example, that can happen. When you take into account the cost, the economic value of all these additional benefits, they have very high benefit to cost ratios, especially over the long term. They can involve local people if they're done well and appropriately, and they can build adaptive capacity. But of course, there are all sorts of challenges. They require land. They can take quite a long time to establish. We lack data currently from how well they do in the more extreme events. The economics are a little bit harder to work out, and they offer variable levels of protection. Meanwhile, engineered solutions bring a lot of benefits. They can address immediate challenges. There's a lot of expertise. The economics and the finances around them are easier, so the costs and the performances of them are more predictable. So there are clear advantages of engineered, but they're generally only designed to deal with single hazards from climate change. They can fail over time. The maintenance costs can be incredibly high. They're quite carbon intensive, quite energy intensive. They clearly don't bring any other benefits, for example, carbon absorption, and they often harm biodiversity locally. So what's very clear is that depending on the location and the extent of the threat, the frequency of the threat, and so on, we're going to need hybrid approaches that bring these approaches together, bring green and grey together. And this is especially needed along the coast, I think, where some of the impacts of climate change are most extreme. So I've got, 3 examples here. You may be familiar with those. Medbury Managed Realignment Project on the south coast, involving the RSPB. So there was originally a shingle bank, which cost around £300,000 a year to maintain, but was still breached every year by the sea and flooded 348 houses and a caravan park quite regularly. So, local communities couldn't get insurance for their houses and so on. They were very vulnerable and increasingly vulnerable to that. However, this managed realignment project was established, which involved basically bringing the new bank much further inland, and the area between the wall and the sea was then allowed to revert to a really healthy salt marsh. And the results were really quite dramatic. Flooding risk reduced from 100%, so certainty of flooding, to 0.1%, and it was estimated that this will save around £78 million a year over the next 100 years. And of course, there are major biodiversity benefits and indeed carbon benefits of bringing back that salt marsh. And it involved the creation as well of more paths in the nature reserve, but it wasn't sort of plain sailing. There was some parts of the community that were, upset about a lack of access to the beach that the intervention involved. So there's always trade-offs. There's always careful work that needs to be done with local communities, of course. Another example, so this is an example from Devon. Beavers are a great nature-based solution, as I'm sure you all know. And beavers were introduced into the River Otter in 2015 as part of a five-year trial. Very successful project in that the otters built 28 dams on the tributaries, which reduced flood risk to a village on one of the side streams. But some of the farmland did flood elsewhere. I mean, beavers do have a very big impact. They're big ecosystem engineers. But then it involved some interactions where volunteers removed or lowered the dams. There's some nice human-beaver interactions to create flow bypass devices, and this worked very well. It resulted in a rich mosaic of ponds and wetlands. There were more water voles, amphibians, more trout, the lamprey, there were more eco-tourists. Beavers were mainly welcomed by the local residents, but it was obviously very, these projects require a lot of planning and careful interaction with local communities and so forth. Again, lots of careful work really needed there, participatory work needed there. And the third example was the one I wanted to just sort of mention this one. This was natural flood management at Eddleston Water. So this was a previously very straight river in a very heavily grazed catchment, so a very sort of familiar scenario across the UK. 500 properties were downstream or at risk of flooding. But it was designated a sort of special area of conservation interest, but actually the ecological health, the health of the ecosystems was very poor. So the Tweed Forum worked with local landowners. They planted 200 hectares of native trees and cross-slope hedgerows in the upper catchment. They created log barriers on the high tributaries. They created wetlands and ponds and so forth, and basically re-wiggled. So that's a nature-based solution involving re-wiggled, re-meandered about 3 kilometres of the river and removed the embankment. So quite a big intervention, with costs of course, but lots of results. So, they had 12 years of baseline data from the streams and rain gauges. They showed that flood peaks reduced by 30% and were delayed for over 4 hours, avoiding considerable sum in terms of flood damage, nearly £1 million. There were benefits to carbon storage and water quality. Improve the aesthetic value of the area, increasing ecotourism and so forth. So many benefits, and it's most especially, there were considerable improvements in the health of the ecosystem in tandem with a large, flood damages were avoided. Around £2.85 million worth of flood damages were avoided as a result of the intervention. So I think, no surprise that, that there were lots of, clear evidences that there were benefits, economic benefits as well as biodiversity benefits. But there were many different types of barriers were identified, through our surveys and workshops. And they were common to almost all nature-based solutions, and they're listed here. And I'll just very briefly sort of pull out some examples. So in terms of information, a barrier was identified as a lack of awareness of the evidence and metrics on the costs and benefits of nature-based solutions, and also a lack of practical skills and knowledge. In terms of funding, the co-benefits of these interventions are often ignored, and there's problems around the lack of robust valuation methodology. And then at the moment, for nature-based solutions, the donor focus is very much on carbon rather than adaptation, which brings many problems indeed. In terms of the governance, often stakeholders are operating in silos. You'll be very aware of that. Different beneficiaries receive different benefits, and there's these, as I mentioned before, these trade-offs over different types of land use. Policy and regulation, often conflicting policy goals, and a bias, as I've already mentioned, towards nature-based solutions. And in terms of ecosystem pressure, we know that the integrity of our ecosystems are at risk from pollution, climate change, invasive species, and so forth. And all of that needs to be managed for when implementing nature-based solutions. I think there were, by talking to practitioners, we found a long list of recommendations on how to overcome these barriers, but we were able to group them into 5 broad categories. And I'll go through these briefly now. First of all, we need to integrate a wider range of nature-based solutions into the national adaptation plans. Some in previous NAPs, some nature-based solutions are broadly supported, in particular peat restoration, bringing trees into urban areas, and natural flood management, such as planting trees along rivers and re-wiggling rivers. But there were very important ecosystems that were not supported, not included, such as the restoration and protection of kelp and seagrass, agroforestry and agroecology, despite the many benefits not being supported in the policy space, and rewilding and natural regeneration of ecosystems as well. I've mentioned also, that there's a need to mainstream nature-based solutions by developing coherent policies across the sectors, so cross-parliamentary working groups, cross-sectoral working groups. There's just briefly here, just an example of a lack of joined-up policy, for example. Seagrass restoration, which we know brings benefits in terms of coastal resilience and biodiversity and supporting fisheries and so forth, is treated the same as damaging activities, such as aggregate extraction. So licenses can cost, £10,000. So we've got similar licensing and planning barriers for the beneficial use of dredging material in leaky dams. So we need licence fees that are capped or removed for nature-based solution projects that follow good practice in pre-approved areas. So it feels like a sort of a low-hanging fruit in terms of developing more coherent policies. Obviously, we need more funding for high-quality nature-based solutions, specifically addressing climate change adaptation. We need to fund the implementation of nature-based solutions, but also the monitoring of their benefits and knowledge exchange. So currently it was felt that there's been a lack of information in the farming community around agroforestry and agroecology that needs addressing, and farm education centres, of course, can help with that. But it needs to be a two-way knowledge exchange, because we also appreciate that farmers across the country also have a great deal of knowledge on how to work with nature in a warming world, and are in many places just getting on with looking after their landscapes, and this is helping with protecting their crops from flooding and so forth. We need to think about standards for high quality and resilient nature-based solution. Oversimplistic targets and weak standards can lead to poor quality interventions that underperform or even cause damage. So wrong trees in the wrong places, for example. There's the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, which is it's around operationalising nature-based solutions, very user-friendly framework that has actually been piloted in the UK at the moment, with a set of 8 standards around what good looks like when it comes to nature-based solutions. And I've got just a few. I'm aware of time and the need for questions in the other talk, so I'll just say that there's lots of important aspects we need to think about what good standard for implementing and scaling up nature-based solutions look like. They're listed here, but again, if you are interested in more detail around what was identified as important in this, you can look at the report. So I think the final important aspect is that in a warming world, we know we're going to have to manage our landscapes in a very adaptive way. We're going to have to monitor the extent to which they're delivering the benefits they were designed to deliver, and adapt to that. In a warming world, we're not entirely sure what a flourishing landscape in the UK looks like, and we're going to have to monitor things, maybe change the species mixes we're using, change our restoration approaches as the climate warms and as ecosystems respond to that warming. So I'll end with this. So 5 recommendations for scaling up high-quality nature-based solutions for adaptation in the UK. Hopefully these might be useful for your discussions later today.